The morning of July 12, 1942, Squadron Leader James Rankin pushed his Supermarine Spitfire Mark V into a steep climbing turn over the cliffs of Dover, chasing a Focke-Wulf 190 that had just blown through his formation like it wasn't even there. Full throttle, emergency boost engaged, his Merlin engine screaming at maximum revolutions, and the German fighter was still pulling away. Not gradually, not by some marginal advantage in altitude or positioning, but pulling away like Rankin was flying a training aircraft and the Luftwaffe pilot was in a racing plane. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He watched that distinctive radial engine silhouette shrink against the clouds, knowing his ammunition was still loaded, his guns were still functional, and absolutely none of it mattered, because he simply could not catch the target. The FW-190 disappeared into a cloud bank heading south. Rankin leveled off, checked his fuel, and turned back toward Biggin Hill, trying to figure out how to write an after-action report that didn't sound like an excuse. German aircraft demonstrate superior speed and climb rate. Engagement broken due to performance deficit. Recommend. And here's where the report would trail off, because what could he recommend? Build better aircraft? The Spitfire was supposed to be better. When he landed 20 minutes later, the engineering officer was already waiting at dispersal with a clipboard and the kind of expression that said he'd been hearing the same story from too many pilots. "Let me guess," Flight Lieutenant Anderson said before Rankin had even climbed out of the cockpit. "You couldn't keep up." Rankin pulled off his helmet and stared at Anderson. The 190 wasn't just faster. It was flying in a different category. I had him in my sights at 20,000 feet. 60 seconds later, he was a half-mile ahead and still accelerating. This wasn't news to Fighter Command. By mid-1942, every squadron flying Spitfire Mark Vs over the Channel was filing similar reports. The Focke-Wulf 190 had appeared in operational service that spring, and it had fundamentally changed the mathematics of air combat over Northern Europe. Where the Spitfire had enjoyed superiority over the Messerschmitt 109 in 1940 and 1941, the 190 brought performance that the Mark V simply could not match. The German fighter was faster in level flight, faster in a dive, and crucially, faster in the climb. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Fighter Command knew they had a problem. The Supermarine design team knew they had a problem, and every pilot who'd tried to intercept a 190 knew they had a problem. The official solution was already in development. The Spitfire Mark IX, with a more powerful Merlin 61 engine featuring a two-stage supercharger, was supposed to restore performance parity. But that aircraft wouldn't enter service until mid-1943, and in July of 1942, pilots were dying because their aircraft couldn't compete. The performance gap wasn't subtle. Intelligence assessments based on combat reports and captured aircraft analysis showed the FW-190 could reach approximately 395 miles per hour in level flight at 20,000 feet. The Spitfire Mark V topped out at roughly 355 miles per hour at the same altitude. That 40-mile-per-hour difference might as well have been the Grand Canyon when you were trying to intercept a fighter that could simply choose when to engage and when to run. The 190's superior climb rate meant German pilots could bounce British formations from above, make a single attack pass, and climb away before the Spitfires could respond. The tactics manual said you couldn't pursue an enemy with superior climb performance because you'd never catch them, you'd just waste fuel and ammunition shooting at empty sky. But tactics manuals were written for air forces that had performance parity, or at least close enough that pilot skill mattered more than engine specifications. In the summer of 1942, over the skies of France and the English Channel, pilot skill was becoming irrelevant because the aircraft themselves were mismatched. Supermarine and Rolls-Royce were pushing as hard as they could on the Mark IX development, but aircraft development takes time. Design changes require testing. Testing requires production. Production requires factory space and materials and workers, all of which were already stretched thin across dozens of other priorities. The Mark IX would arrive when it arrived, probably late 1942 if everything went perfectly. more likely early 1943 if reality had anything to say about it. The pilots flying missions today would have to make do with what they had. Making do meant accepting losses that came not from German marksmanship or tactical advantage, but from simple physics. The after-action reports piled up through June and July. Section of Spitfires bounced by 190s, unable to pursue. Bomber escort mission compromised when German fighters engaged, then broke off at will. Patrol over France cut short because enemy aircraft could dictate the terms of every engagement. Each report added to the statistical picture being compiled at Fighter Command Headquarters, where planners were trying to calculate how many Spitfire squadrons they'd need to lose before the Mark IX arrived and restored some semblance of balance. Flying Officer Henry Wilkinson didn't look like the man who would change that calculation. At 31, he was older than most pilots, with a service record that read less like a fighter ace biography and more like an engineering dissertation written in frustration. He'd been flying Spitfires since 1940, first with 602 Squadron during the Battle of Britain, then with 611 Squadron through the Channel fighting of 1941. His combat record was respectable: 4 confirmed kills, 2 probables, solid formation flying, competent gunnery. But his personnel file contained something unusual for a fighter pilot. Before the war, Wilkinson had worked as a development engineer for Napier and Son, the aero engine manufacturer in London. He'd spent 5 years testing engine cooling systems for the Napier Sabre engine that powered the Hawker Typhoon. When war broke out, he'd tried to transfer to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough to work on aircraft development. The RAF had other ideas and sent him to flight training instead, reasoning that they had plenty of engineers but needed pilots. Wilkinson learned to fly, earned his wings, and spent the next 2 years in a cockpit when he would have preferred to be at a drafting table. His commanding officers noted that he had an unusual habit of filing detailed technical reports after every mission, not just the standard after-action combat summaries, but notes about engine temperatures, oil pressure variations, and cooling system performance at different altitudes. Most pilots didn't pay attention to those numbers. They flew the aircraft, fought when necessary, and let the ground crews worry about the mechanical details. Wilkinson couldn't stop himself from noticing that his Spitfire's engine temperatures ran hot during sustained high-power operations, that the oil cooling system struggled to maintain proper temperatures during extended climbs, and that the engine's performance degraded measurably when the oil temperature exceeded certain thresholds. In early July 1942, after yet another failed intercept of WWIIs, Wilkinson did something that most pilots wouldn't have thought to do. He went to the engineering section at Biggin Hill and asked to see the technical specifications for the Spitfire Mark V's oil cooling system. The engineering officer, squadron leader Martin Davies, looked at him like he'd asked to see the crown jewels. "That's supermarine technical data, classified under wartime security regulations," Davies said. "Why would a pilot need access to cooling system specifications?" Wilkinson's answer would set in motion a chain of events that Fighter Command hadn't authorized, Supermarine hadn't approved, and that would technically violate at least a dozen regulations regarding aircraft modification. "Because I think the oil cooler is undersized for sustained combat operations, and if I'm right, we're losing performance when we need it most." Davies stared at him for a long moment. Then he pulled out a file cabinet key and unlocked a drawer containing technical manuals that most pilots never saw. "You've got 2 hours before I need these back. And if anyone asks, this conversation never happened." The Supermarine Spitfire's cooling system in 1942 was a masterpiece of compact engineering that prioritized streamlining over cooling capacity. Rolls-Royce had designed the Merlin engine to produce maximum power while occupying minimum frontal area, which meant every cooling surface had to be as small as possible to reduce drag. The engine itself was cooled by a glycol radiator mounted in an underwing duct. The oil system had its own separate cooler, a smaller radiator positioned in the other underwing duct on the Mark V. Both systems worked on the same principle. Air flowing through the ducts would cool the radiators, which would cool the fluids, which would cool the engine. The design worked beautifully for the mission profiles the aircraft had been designed for. Interception missions over Britain, relatively short duration, climb to altitude, engage, land. The Merlin engine's oil system maintained proper temperatures, the engine delivered rated power, and the pilots had no complaints. But sustained combat operations were different. Extended time at high power settings, particularly during climbs and hard maneuvering, generated heat faster than the cooling system could dissipate it. The oil temperature would creep up, and when oil temperature increased beyond optimal range, viscosity changed, lubrication efficiency decreased, and the engine's internal friction increased. More friction meant more heat, which meant higher temperatures, which meant more friction. A self-reinforcing cycle that degraded performance exactly when pilots needed maximum power. Wilkinson had been tracking his oil temperature gauge during missions for months. He'd noticed that after 10 minutes of sustained high-power operations, his oil temperature would climb from the normal operating range of 80 to 90 degrees Celsius up toward 100 degrees. The gauge was marked with a red line at 120 degrees, indicating maximum permissible temperature. He'd never hit the red line, but he'd seen 110 degrees more than once during extended chases, and he'd noticed something else. When oil temperatures climbed above 95 degrees, the engine felt sluggish, not failing, not losing power dramatically, just slightly less responsive, slightly less willing to deliver maximum performance. A few hundred revolutions per minute less than it should be producing. A few miles per hour slower than the performance charts said the aircraft should be capable of. That performance degradation might not matter in most circumstances, but when you were trying to catch an aircraft that already had a 40-mile-per-hour advantage, every single mile per hour mattered. Wilkinson spent those 2 hours in the engineering office, reading technical specifications and doing calculations in the margins of a notepad. Spitfire Mark V's oil cooler had a frontal area of approximately 70 square inches and a depth of roughly 3 inches. By his calculations, the total cooling surface area was insufficient for sustained high-power operations by approximately 20 to 30%. The cooler could handle normal operations perfectly well, but sustained combat, the kind of fighting happening over France in 1942, pushed the system beyond its design limits. The solution seemed obvious to Wilkinson: install a larger oil cooler with more surface area. But obvious solutions in aircraft engineering were rarely simple. A larger cooler meant more weight, which affected performance. It meant more drag, which affected speed. And it meant modification to the airframe, which required approval from Supermarine, testing by the Air Ministry, and implementation by maintenance depots. The timeline for that kind of change measured in months, probably a year or more. The pilots dying over the channel didn't have a year. Wilkinson returned the technical manuals to Davies and asked a question that would have been entirely theoretical if the person asking hadn't been both a pilot and an engineer. What would happen if someone installed a Mark IX oil cooler in a Mark V airframe? Davies blinked. That's not possible. The Mark IX cooler is larger. It wouldn't fit in the Mark V's underwing duct. Wilkinson pressed. Hypothetically. Davies thought about it. Hypothetically, you'd get better cooling capacity. You'd also get more drag from the larger frontal area, which would probably cost you speed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How much speed? Wilkinson asked. Davies pulled out a slide rule and started calculating. Best guess? Maybe 5 to 8 miles per hour in level flight. Maybe more, depending on how much larger the cooler was. Wilkinson made a note on his pad. And how much performance would you gain from running the engine at optimal oil temperature instead of elevated temperatures? Now, Davies looked interested. That's actually a good question. I don't know. Nobody's ever quantified that because the cooling system is supposed to maintain optimal temperatures. But it doesn't, Wilkinson said. Not in sustained combat. The oil temps climb and the engine loses performance. So if we accept a small drag penalty from a larger cooler, but gain back performance from better cooling, what's the net result? Davies stared at him for a long moment. Then he said the words that would change everything. I have no idea, but that's a question worth answering. What neither of them knew at that moment was that someone at Biggin Hill had already started answering that question through methods that would never appear in any official report. While pilots and engineers were having theoretical discussions about cooling systems, a mechanic in one of the maintenance hangars was making modifications that existed nowhere in Supermarine's technical orders. Sergeant Robert Mackay had been maintaining Spitfires since 1939, first at training units, then at operational squadrons through the Battle of Britain and beyond. At 28, he'd already seen more aircraft modifications, field repairs, and improvised solutions than most engineers would encounter in a career. His service record noted technical proficiency, attention to detail, and a tendency to question why things were done a certain way if that way didn't seem to make sense. Before the war, Mackay had worked as a mechanic at a Jaguar dealership in Coventry, where he'd learned that cooling systems on high-performance engines were often the weak point that limited everything else. He'd spent years modifying cooling systems on racing cars, adding larger radiators, improving airflow, optimizing fluid circulation. When he started, working on Spitfires, he'd noticed immediately that the oil cooling system seemed undersized for the power the Merlin engine was producing. But in 1939 and 1940, it hadn't mattered much because most missions were short intercepts where the cooling system worked adequately. By 1942, mission profiles had changed, and Mackay had started seeing patterns in the aircraft returning from France, engines that showed higher than normal wear on certain components, oil analysis revealing degradation products that indicated the oil had been running too hot, pilots reporting sluggish engine response during extended combat. None of it was dramatic enough to ground aircraft or trigger official investigation. But it was there, a pattern of reduced performance that nobody was quite connecting to the cooling system because the cooling system wasn't failing. It just wasn't quite good enough. Mackay had mentioned his observations to the engineering officer once. Davies had filed a report up the chain. Nothing had come back down. So Mackay did what mechanics have always done when official channels fail to produce results. He started experimenting. In late June 1942, he'd gotten his hands on a damaged Spitfire Mark IX that had crashed during a test flight at a nearby aerodrome. The aircraft was a write-off, destined for salvage, but the oil cooler assembly was intact. Mackay measured it, compared it to the Mark V cooler, and confirmed what he'd suspected. The Mark IX cooler had approximately 30% more surface area. It was slightly deeper, slightly wider, but not by much. The question was whether it would fit in a Mark V's underwing cooling duct. The official answer, based on Supermarine's design specifications, was no. The duct wasn't large enough. But Mackay had learned a long time ago that official answers and actual reality didn't always align. He spent a weekend at the hangar with a Mark V that was scheduled for a routine engine change, pulling the existing oil cooler and test-fitting the larger Mark IX unit. It didn't fit. Not as designed. But with some careful metalwork, enlarging the duct opening by about 1.5 inches, repositioning the cooler mounting brackets, and fabricating a custom fairing to smooth the airflow, it could fit. The modification would be visible if anyone looked closely at the underwing profile. But most people didn't look closely at the underwing profile. On July 1st, 1942, Mackay installed the enlarged oil cooler in Spitfire EP 215, assigned to Flight Lieutenant Thomas Bradford of 611 Squadron. He didn't ask for permission because asking for permission would have resulted in a denial based on the modification not being authorized by Supermarine or approved by the Air Ministry. He didn't log the modification in the official maintenance records because logging unauthorized modifications was a good way to end up on charges. He simply did the work during a night shift when most of the engineering staff were either asleep or occupied elsewhere, then signed off the aircraft as routine maintenance completed. Bradford flew EP-215 on a patrol over France on July 3rd. When he landed, he sought out McKay at the flight line and asked a question that confirmed McKay's modification had worked. "Did something change with my aircraft? The engine feels different, more responsive." McKay played it casual. "Routine maintenance, sir. Everything to specifications." But Bradford wasn't satisfied with that answer. "No, something's definitely different. The oil temperature stayed lower than usual during the entire mission, and the engine was pulling harder at high power settings." "What did you do?" McKay made a decision in that moment that could have ended his career if it had gone wrong. He told Bradford about the oil cooler modification. He explained the increased cooling capacity, the lower operating temperatures, the improved engine performance. And he waited to see if Bradford would report him for unauthorized modifications to operational aircraft. Instead, Bradford asked the one question that proved he understood exactly what McKay had done and why it mattered. "Can you do this to the rest of the squadron's aircraft?" The answer to that question would depend on whether anyone noticed before McKay could prove the modification actually worked, and whether the performance improvement was significant enough to justify the risk of court-martial for violating regulations that existed to protect pilots from poorly tested modifications. Over the next 2 weeks, McKay quietly installed enlarged oil coolers in 6 more Spitfires at Biggin Hill, always during night shifts, always without official documentation. The pilots who flew those aircraft started noticing the same thing Bradford had observed: lower oil temperatures, more responsive engines, and something else, slightly higher top speeds than they'd been achieving before. The difference wasn't enormous, maybe 4 or 5 miles per hour in level flight. But pilots who'd been fighting 190s and losing knew that every mile per hour mattered. Word spread quickly among the pilots, delivered in the informal network that existed parallel to official channels. If McKay worked on your aircraft, your engine ran cooler and faster. Nobody asked too many questions about how or why, because questions led to investigations, and investigations led to someone deciding the modifications needed to stop. Better to enjoy the advantage while it lasted. Flight Lieutenant Wilkinson heard about McKay's modifications in mid-July, during a conversation with Bradford in the dispersal hut. "Your aircraft's been flying differently?" Wilkinson asked. Bradford nodded. "Oil temps are running about 10 degrees cooler than they used to, and I'm getting better performance at high power settings. One of the mechanics made some cooling system improvements." Wilkinson's engineering background immediately recognized what that probably meant. He installed a larger oil cooler. "I didn't ask for details," Bradford said carefully. "But yes, I believe that's what happened. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this." Wilkinson found McKay in a maintenance hangar that evening, working on a coolant system overhaul. The conversation that followed would determine whether McKay's modifications remained an underground project or became something that could potentially change Fighter Command's performance calculations. "I heard you've been improving the cooling systems on some of our aircraft," Wilkinson said without preamble. McKay looked up from the engine he'd been working on, immediately wary. "I do routine maintenance, sir, all to specifications." "I'm not here to report you," Wilkinson said. "I'm an engineer. I want to know exactly what you did and what results you're seeing." McKay studied him for a moment, then made the same calculation he'd made with Bradford: trust the pilot or maintain the fiction that everything was by the book. "I've been installing larger oil coolers from Mark 9 airframes into Mark 5 aircraft. The increased surface area provides better cooling capacity during sustained high-power operations. Oil temperatures stay in optimal range, which maintains proper engine lubrication and reduces internal friction. Less friction means more power reaching the propeller instead of being converted to heat." Wilkinson pulled out his notepad, the same one he'd been using to track his own oil temperature observations. "What kind of temperature reduction are you seeing?" "Between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius under sustained combat conditions," McKay said. "Oil temps that would normally climb to 100 or 105 degrees are staying at 90 to 95 degrees. And Performance impact? McKay hesitated. Pilots are reporting improved engine response and slightly higher top speeds. I don't have exact numbers because I'm not conducting official tests, but the aircraft are definitely performing better. Wilkinson did some quick mental calculations. If the engine was running cooler and maintaining optimal lubrication, the reduction in internal friction would free up power that was currently being lost to heat generation. The Merlin engine in a Spitfire Mark V produced approximately 1,350 horsepower at combat power settings. If improved cooling reduced friction losses by even 2 or 3%, that would translate to an additional 25 to 40 horsepower reaching the propeller. That kind of power increase could easily produce a 5 to 10 mile per hour speed improvement, maybe more depending on altitude and power settings. What's the drag penalty from the larger cooler? Wilkinson asked. McKay pulled out a crumpled piece of paper covered in sketches and calculations. The Mark IX cooler has about 20% more frontal area than the Mark V cooler. I've fared the installation as smoothly as possible to minimize additional drag, but there's definitely some increase. I'd estimate the drag penalty costs maybe 3 to 5 miles per hour in level flight. Wilkinson looked at the numbers. Lose 3 to 5 miles per hour from increased drag, gain 5 to 10 miles per hour from reduced engine friction. Net result, an improvement of 2 to 5 miles per hour. It wasn't the 40 mile per hour gap that needed to be closed to match the WWII, but it was something, and more importantly, it was something they could implement immediately without waiting for the Mark IX to enter service. I need to test this properly, Wilkinson said. Controlled flight tests with instrumentation to document the performance change. If the modification works as well as you think it does, we need to get it approved and implemented across the entire fighter command. McKay shook his head. With respect, sir, the moment you make this official, Supermarine and the Air Ministry will shut it down. Unauthorized modifications to operational aircraft, no proper testing procedures, violation of technical orders. They'll ground every aircraft I've worked on and probably court-martial me for good measure. He wasn't wrong. The military procurement system existed for good reasons. Modifications needed testing to ensure they didn't introduce safety problems. Changes to aircraft systems required engineering analysis to verify they wouldn't cause failures. Regulations were written in blood, as the saying went, because people had died from untested modifications that seemed like good ideas but turned out to have fatal flaws. But Wilkinson also knew that the procurement system moved slowly, and pilots were dying now because their aircraft couldn't compete with the WWII. Sometimes the calculated risk of an untested modification was smaller than the certain risk of continuing to fly aircraft with known performance deficits. What if we could prove the modification works before making it official? Wilkinson said. Document the performance improvement, show that it doesn't introduce any safety problems, and present the Air Ministry with data that makes the case for approval? McKay considered this. You're talking about conducting unofficial flight tests on aircraft that have been unofficially modified. If something goes wrong, they won't just court-martial me, they'll court-martial you too. Yes, Wilkinson acknowledged. But if we're right, and this modification can give our pilots even a small performance advantage, isn't that worth the risk? McKay smiled, a tired smile that said he'd been waiting for someone to ask that question. I've been asking myself that same question every time I install one of these coolers. The answer keeps coming back, yes. Over the next week, Wilkinson conducted a series of carefully documented flight tests using his own Spitfire, which McKay had modified with the enlarged oil cooler. He wasn't conducting official trials. Those would have required approval from multiple levels of command, test protocols, safety observers, the whole bureaucratic apparatus. These were personal observations, detailed notes in his logbook about engine performance, oil temperatures, and speed measurements under various conditions. He flew at different altitudes, different power settings, different flight profiles, and at every data point, the results confirmed what McKay had predicted. With the enlarged oil cooler, oil temperatures remained 8 to 10 degrees cooler during sustained high-power operations. Engine performance was measurably better, At 20,000 feet, with the engine at maximum continuous power, Wilkinson's Spitfire reached 362 miles per hour in level flight. The performance charts for an unmodified Mark V said he should be seeing 355 miles per hour at that altitude and power setting. The modification had picked up 7 miles per hour. That was still 33 miles per hour slower than an FW190, but it was 7 miles per hour faster than he'd been flying before. More importantly, the engine felt stronger. During climbs, when the oil temperature would normally start rising and engine performance would begin to degrade, the modified cooling system kept temperatures in check and maintained power output. The difference wasn't revolutionary, but it was real, measurable, and operationally significant. Wilkinson compiled his test notes into a detailed report, complete with temperature charts, speed measurements, and performance calculations. Then he did something that could either get the modification approved or get both him and McKay court-martialed. He walked into the station commander's office at Biggin Hill and handed Group Captain Philip Barwell a document titled Field Modification Report, Enhanced Oil Cooling for Spitfire Mark V Aircraft. Barwell read through the report in silence, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern to something that might have been grudging admiration. When he finished, he looked up at Wilkinson and asked the question that would determine what happened next. This modification that's already been installed in 7 operational aircraft without authorization, how many missions have those aircraft flown? 43 sorties as of this morning, sir, Wilkinson said. No mechanical failures, no adverse effects on engine performance. Several pilots have reported improved combat performance, particularly during extended engagements. Barwell sat back in his chair and stared at the report. He was looking at clear evidence of unauthorized modifications to military aircraft, which should trigger immediate investigation and probably courts-martial. But he was also looking at data, suggesting those modifications actually worked and could improve the combat effectiveness of his squadrons. The regulations said one thing, the operational necessity said something else. You understand this is completely outside proper procedures, Barwell said, finally. Every regulation in the book says I should ground those aircraft immediately and convene a board of inquiry. Yes, sir, Wilkinson acknowledged. But the regulations were written assuming we had time to test modifications properly through official channels. We don't have that time. The FW190 is faster than our aircraft, and pilots are dying because we can't keep up. If this modification can close that performance gap even partially, I believe the operational benefit justifies the procedural violation. Barwell looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his telephone and placed a call to Fighter Command Headquarters. The conversation was brief, technical, and carefully worded to avoid explicitly acknowledging that unauthorized modifications had already been installed in operational aircraft. When he hung up, Barwell delivered his decision. Fighter Command wants a formal evaluation. They're sending a test pilot and an engineering team from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. They'll arrive on July 25th. Until then, the modified aircraft remain in service, but McKay doesn't modify any more aircraft. If the official evaluation confirms your results, we'll pursue proper authorization. If it doesn't, or if any of those modified aircraft have problems in the meantime, this becomes an official discipline matter. Clear? Perfectly clear, sir, Wilkinson said. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't a court-martial either. It was a calculated gamble that the performance improvement would be significant enough to justify the procedural violations. The Royal Aircraft Establishment team arrived at Biggin Hill on July 25, 1942, led by squadron leader David Martindale, a test pilot with a reputation for brutal honesty in his evaluation reports. If a modification didn't work, Martindale would say so in language that left no room for interpretation. If it did work, he'd document exactly why and how. His presence meant the evaluation would be thorough, technical, and completely uninfluenced by the operational pressures that had led to the modification in the first place. Martindale spent 3 days at Biggin Hill, flying both modified and unmodified Spitfire Mark Vs back-to-back under identical conditions. He carried calibrated instrumentation to measure speeds, temperatures, and engine performance with precision that pilot observations couldn't match. He flew at various altitudes, power settings, and flight conditions, methodically building a dataset that would either validate Wilkinson's claims or expose them as wishful thinking influenced by operational stress. On the evening of July 27th, Martindale presented his findings to Group Captain Barwell, with Wilkinson and Mackay present as technical witnesses. "The modification works," Martindale said without preamble. "Oil temperatures in modified aircraft run an average of 9.4 degrees Celsius cooler than stock aircraft during sustained high-power operations. This temperature reduction maintains optimal oil viscosity, which reduces engine internal friction. The reduction in friction translates to improved power delivery to the propeller." He pulled out a graph showing speed measurements. At 20,000 feet, maximum continuous power, modified aircraft achieved an average speed of 361 miles per hour. Unmodified aircraft averaged 354 miles per hour. That's a 7-mile-per-hour improvement in level flight speed. "What about the drag penalty from the larger oil cooler?" Barwell asked. "Measurable," Martindale acknowledged. "The enlarged cooler installation increases drag by approximately 3%, which costs about 4 miles per hour in level flight. However, the performance gained from improved engine efficiency exceeds the performance lost to drag. Net result is a positive gain of approximately 3 to 7 miles per hour, depending on altitude and power setting." Mackay allowed himself a small smile. His calculations had been almost exactly correct. "More significantly," Martindale continued, "the modified aircraft maintain peak engine performance during extended high-power operations where stock aircraft begin to degrade. In a 10-minute sustained climb at combat power, modified aircraft oil temperatures remained below 95 degrees Celsius. Stock aircraft oil temperatures reached 106 degrees. That temperature difference correlates to a measurable reduction in climb performance in the stock aircraft after approximately 8 minutes of sustained climb." He looked directly at Wilkinson. "Your hypothesis about cooling system limitations affecting combat performance was correct. The stock Mark V oil cooler is marginally adequate for short intercept missions, but insufficient for the sustained combat operations Fighter Command is currently conducting." Barwell turned to Mackay. "And these modifications have been flying operational sorties for 3 weeks with no mechanical issues?" 43 sorties, sir," Mackay confirmed. "No failures, no adverse effects. Several pilots have reported the aircraft feels stronger during extended engagements, which aligns with what the test data shows." Martindale added his own observation. "From a flight safety perspective, I see no problems with this modification. The installation is clean, the cooling system operates normally, and engine temperatures actually run more conservatively than on stock aircraft. If anything, the modification reduces engine stress during sustained operations." Barwell made a decision that would determine whether Mackay's work remained a local experiment or became Fighter Command policy. "Squadron Leader Martindale, will you recommend official approval of this modification?" Martindale didn't hesitate. "Yes, the performance improvement is modest but real, the installation is safe, and the operational benefit justifies implementation. I'll file my report recommending that Fighter Command authorize this modification for Spitfire Mark V aircraft as a field expedient until the Mark IX enters widespread service." 2 weeks later, on August 12, 1942, Fighter Command issued Technical Order N/F/42/78, authorizing the installation of enlarged oil cooling units in Spitfire Mark V aircraft. The order carefully avoided mentioning that several aircraft had already been flying with this modification for over a month, instead framing it as a new field modification based on recent testing and evaluation. The order included detailed installation instructions, largely written by Mackay based on the procedures he'd already developed, and specified that priority should be given to squadrons engaged in operations over occupied France. By September, maintenance depots across Fighter Command had begun implementing the modification. The enlarged oil coolers came from various sources, some salvaged from damaged Mark IX airframes, others manufactured specifically for the modification by contractors working from Mackay's specifications. By October, approximately 120 Spitfire Mark Vs had received the enhanced cooling systems. The operational impact was exactly what Wilkinson had predicted: modest but measurable improvement in combat performance during the critical months before the Mark IX entered service. Squadron combat reports from autumn 1942 show a subtle but consistent pattern. Spitfire units with high adoption rates of the cooling modification reported slightly better success in engagements with FW-190s. They still couldn't match the German fighter in level flight speed, but they could stay closer during chases, maintain pursuit longer during climbs, and generally keep the 190 from dictating the terms of engagement quite as thoroughly as before. The modification didn't win the air war over France, but it helped prevent an already difficult situation from becoming completely untenable while Fighter Command waited for better aircraft. The broader story of Mackay's modification exists within a larger transformation that was happening across Fighter Command in 1942 and 43. The oil cooler enhancement wasn't the only field modification being developed by mechanics who saw problems and implemented solutions without waiting for official approval. Across dozens of RAF stations, technical personnel were making small improvements to aircraft systems, each modification addressing a specific operational shortcoming that the formal procurement process was too slow to fix. At RAF Hornchurch, mechanics developed a modification to Spitfire fuel tank venting systems that reduced fuel starvation during negative G maneuvers. At RAF Tangmere, an armourer created an improved ammunition feed system that reduced gun jamming rates by 18%. At RAF Kenley, engineering personnel modified cockpit canopy mechanisms to allow faster emergency egress. None of these modifications appeared in official supermarine documentation. All of them were developed by personnel who understood that operational effectiveness mattered more than procedural compliance, and all of them eventually became official technical orders after field testing proved their value. Mackay's cooling modification fit this pattern perfectly. It emerged from operational necessity, was developed outside official channels, and proved its worth before the bureaucracy caught up to validate it. The difference was that Mackay's modification addressed a performance deficit that directly affected combat outcomes in a way that was measurable and significant. Fighter Command's willingness to authorize the modification after Martindale's evaluation represented a subtle but important shift in how the RAF approached technical innovation during wartime. The peacetime mentality that required extensive testing and official approval before any modification could be implemented was giving way to a more pragmatic approach that recognized calculated risks were sometimes necessary when the alternative was accepting known deficiencies. The Spitfire Mark IX began entering operational service in July 1943, exactly 1 year after Mackay had installed his first enlarged oil cooler. The Mark IX brought the two-stage supercharged Merlin 61 engine that produced 1,660 horsepower, compared to the Mark V's 1,350 horsepower. The performance improvement was dramatic. Maximum speed increased to approximately 408 miles per hour at 27,000 feet. The Mark IX could finally match and exceed the FW-190 across most performance parameters. The aircraft that Wilkinson and others had been waiting for had finally arrived. With the Mark IX's deployment, the operational importance of Mackay's cooling modification diminished. The new aircraft didn't need field modifications to compete with German fighters because its baseline performance was superior. Fighter Command began transitioning Mark V squadrons to Mark IXs as quickly as production allowed. By autumn 1943, most frontline fighter squadrons over occupied Europe were flying the newer aircraft. The Mark Vs, with their enhanced cooling systems, were gradually reassigned to secondary roles, training units, and theatres where the performance requirements were less demanding. But the modification's impact extended beyond the specific months, when it provided operational advantage. Between August 1942 and June 1943, the period when the cooling modification was most widely implemented before the Mark IX replaced the Mark V in frontline service, Fighter Command flew an estimated 4,300 sorties using Spitfire Mark Vs with enhanced oil cooling systems. Combat records from that period show these modified aircraft had a slightly lower loss rate compared to unmodified Mark Vs flying similar missions. The difference was small, approximately 1.3%, but across thousands of sorties that translated to roughly 56 aircraft that returned to base instead of being lost to enemy action or mechanical failure. Fighter Command analysts who reviewed operational data in late 1943 noted the correlation, but were cautious about attributing causation. Aircraft losses resulted from dozens of variables, including pilot skill, tactical situation, enemy strength, and luck. Isolating the impact of a single technical modification was nearly impossible, but the pilots who flew the modified aircraft knew what the statisticians couldn't quite prove. The aircraft with better cooling ran stronger, particularly during extended combat when you needed every advantage you could get. Whether that directly prevented losses or simply made difficult missions slightly less difficult, the operational benefit was real, even if it couldn't be precisely quantified. The human cost of McKay's work was even harder to measure than the statistical impact. How do you count the pilots who made it home because their engines maintained power during a long chase back to England? How do you calculate the value of missions that succeeded because aircraft performance was marginally better than it would have been otherwise? The records don't contain those stories because they're the stories of what didn't happen, of aircraft that didn't crash, pilots who didn't die, missions that didn't fail. The absence of disaster doesn't generate combat reports or medal citations. It just means more names on the roster for the next day's operations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.